All right, we're back. It's another Carolina podcast. A little bit early this week, but there's enough going on with South Carolina football, especially in the world of recruiting, that Wes and Chris and I just couldn't wait to get together virtually, of course, as we continue to social distance to do this podcast. It's kind of become I don't know, I'm almost used to it, which is a shame because I miss seeing you guys, but we're still apart. Hopefully sooner rather than later we will be getting back together. The football team's back together. Recruiting is still happening all virtually, and so I guess maybe once recruiting gets back to normal, we can get back to normal in terms of seeing each other and doing this podcast in person. But I wanted to hop on and do this a little bit earlier this week to talk about South Carolina's latest commitment, and that is Jaden Johnson. Wes, I don't know if this was something that was expected. Again, it seems like a lot of these, I don't want to say have come out of left field because these are relationships that have already been established by South Carolina, but in terms of the timing of them, there hasn't, for a lot of these guys, it hasn't been, the big buildup and the big fanfare. It's just been kind of like, oh, hey, I just decided that I want to commit today. So for South Carolina and for Jaden Johnson, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being we completely expected this and 10 being it came completely out of left field, where does this rank?
Yeah, I'd say as far as the commitment yesterday, it was probably a 10. It's something that's been in the works maybe the last couple of weeks. Now, if you go back a few weeks before that, maybe at the time it would have been a 3 or 4. But, I think someone, like you said, South Carolina has developed the relationship for a long time. Will Muschamp has been very involved as well. He's involved with all the guys they target, really, but with him, Jaden Johnson being a defensive back recruit, even though he's listed as an athlete on Rivals, been recruited as a DB for South Carolina. That means both T-Rob and Will Muschamp are both heavily involved and have really built a strong relationship there. This falls in the category, we've talked about some other recruits who have committed places without visiting. This is one for South Carolina where he's actually not visited campus, but just felt very, very strongly about the connection, the relationship there, and chooses South Carolina over some other schools that I think at one time felt like they were in pretty good shape. Georgia Tech, there was some thought that may be where he was headed. From what Chad Simmons told us, our Rivals recruiting analyst there in Georgia, Arkansas at one time felt like they were maybe in pole position, and Oklahoma probably the biggest offer for Jaden Johnson. But yeah, I think someone that South Carolina has liked for a while and that they're happy to get.
Yeah, Chris, you have the write-up on Gamecock Central, and as you look at his list of offers, there's kind of a lot of variance there. Now, there are most guys, like if you're someone that ends up going to Alabama or Clemson or Oklahoma or Georgia or wherever, your offer list is going to be huge, and a lot of smaller schools that don't really have any chance of landing you are going to offer you just because you can't not offer a guy like that. But it's not a huge offer list, and again, I think it's because it's early in the process, but again, there's a lot of variance there. I mean, you have the Georgia Southerns and the East Carolinas and the Georgia States, obviously because he is from Georgia State, but as Wes mentioned, you have Arkansas, which is not in great shape, but still an SEC program, obviously South Carolina, where he just committed, Oklahoma, you have Ole Miss, obviously with Lane Kiffin there now, so maybe a little bit of an added draw, but what has been I guess, from Jaden Johnson's perspective, what's the recruiting process been like that has led to him getting such a kind of a random and eclectic list of offers throughout this process?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is just the nature of the recruiting cycle that we're in. And so, again, you sort of rewind back to late February, early March, when the last visits were wrapping up, unbeknownst to everybody, and the coronavirus hit and the shutdown hit. The questions that we all had were just how would this affect the whole recruiting process? So we've seen more early commitments in general. We still don't know when in-person recruiting will open up. We know that, for example, camp season was basically obliterated. There are a few private camps that are happening here and there, but school camps were eliminated. There was a thought that there'd be some at the end of July. Those were nixed when the NCAA, extended the dead period out. So really no college camps this year at all. And so that's a huge evaluation tool, not only for South Carolina, but a bunch of others. Then, no spring evaluation period. So college coaches are largely going off what previous tape, then what they hear from coaches who have, for example, played against these guys, what they see that, doing some virtual, quote unquote, spring evaluation stops at schools But there's not an opportunity for, say, recruiting analysts who do the rankings. They didn't have a chance this spring to see how certain guys have progressed, or maybe to see guys for the first time. And college coaches are in that same boat. So, yeah, we've seen new offers go out. But the point is, Pearson, that the schools are flying a little bit more blind on guys. They're having to go off what they see. Mm-hmm. And we've seen schools sort of load up on some guys. And what you don't want to do, and maybe some schools are going to sacrifice quality in the end. I'm not relating that point to Jaden Johnson, because I think there's a lot to like about him. He's a guy that South Carolina liked a lot regardless. But, some schools are loading up, and you just got to look at it through that lens of, hey, this is a unique time. You got to sort of see how it plays out. But, he's someone that the staff's been recruiting for a while, and he fell into that category of, like Wes said, even though he hasn't visited on campus, he was ready to commit. He was ready to get things over with heading into his final, senior season, and had a really good bond with the staff. And so it made sense. And it made sense for Carolina in a class where, defensive back maybe a little bit down in terms of attainable targets in the Southeast. And he's a guy that they feel like projects really well with his length and his skill set.
Well, he's played on both sides of the ball, as you mentioned, listed as an athlete, and at 6'2", almost 200 pounds. Is everybody else pretty much recruiting him at defensive back, or was that sort of an advantage for South Carolina in this process?
I mean, he really had, opportunities to play. I mean, South Carolina even looked at him on the offensive side of the ball. The staff believed that he could play there, but they have targeted him, South Carolina has, mostly as a defensive back. I mean, you look at, the coaches recruiting him. Will Muschamp was heavily involved, as he typically is with priority guys. But, T-Rob was heavily involved. And so they talked with him more about, the nickel position, the cornerback position, the dime position. And so that's really where they sort of prioritized him. He was sort of on the board as an athlete with the thought that, hey, if we want to play him in another position, he can. But really, most of the conversation on the South Carolina end was, defensive back. But, that said, really the only thing, he wasn't going to go and play quarterback in college. That's just not his position. But some programs felt like he could play, defensive back or receiver, or just sort of get him to campus and figure out where to put him at that point.
Now, Wes, this is kind of a general philosophical question, but for South Carolina, and we'll say for tiers that are in, or schools that are in sort of that second tier of recruiting. South Carolina doesn't exactly get their pick of the litter on the recruiting trail, not like the perennial college football playoff contenders get. Is there maybe a move because of all the uncertainty in this year's recruiting class, not knowing when you can bring guys on campus for official visits? We're going to talk about the schedule in a little bit, and it could be September 1st. I think maybe that's a day that Will Muschamp mentioned, but with all that uncertainty, is that going to lead schools like, the South Carolinas and the Tennessees and the Arkansas to maybe favor guys that project more versatility? Because if you can't get your number one option at safety and your number one option at receiver, is it maybe better to have someone like Jaden Johnson that you think would have the potential to fill out either of those roles, depending on where else you might come up short because of all the just weirdness in how 2021 is panning out, or at least the class of 2021?
Yeah, well, I think versatility in general, maybe there's a little bit, maybe that helps you a little bit more with the way things are playing out this year. But, in general, especially if you can't get that 4 or 5 star guy that's just almost a no-brainer, anytime you have a guy that has some versatility, maybe can do some different things. And, I think you just covet athleticism in general. And if you're going to miss with a guy who's super athletic, or miss with a guy who's fast. And what I mean by that is, like, if you've got a guy that's maybe borderline, you want to see a little bit more of, but you're in this weird uncertainty that we're in right now, it never hurts to sort of take a chance on a guy that's super athletic. I watched Jaden Johnson's basketball film. That's something that the more I hear from coaches, the more I do this myself. I've tried to, Chris and I have taken in some basketball games of football prospects, and I've started watching the film. When these guys are really good basketball players and just look comfortable, look fluid on the basketball court, a lot of times, to me, that sort of transfers over to the football field as well. So with Jaden Johnson, you're talking about a guy who's very fluid. He's got some bounce on the basketball court to still sort of the basketball terminology you see those guys use. And, I think all that plays a part. And I'm not so sure the guy couldn't help you at receiver if it didn't work out on the defensive side. But I think in general, guys who play quarterback, that's not a bad direction to go either, because most of the time they're one of their current teams, they're one of their high school's best overall athletes, because the coach has just decided, hey, I'm going to put my best player at quarterback. And most of the time they have a good feel for the game. And I personally, even though Jaden mentioned, nickel, dime, corner, I personally think he ends up being, a safety in this scheme, sort of like an R.J. Roderick, like a big-bodied safety. To me, maybe even has the frame to ultimately be a linebacker in today's college football world. You never know what's going to happen once a guy, with a big frame like that gets into a college weight program. But point I'm getting at, if they have an understanding of football, a football IQ, sort of a feel for why an offense is doing what it's doing, that can help. And as we've talked about before, safety is a position in this scheme that requires a lot mentally. So I think that can sort of give you a little bit of a leg up if you come into that position potentially with a really good feel for the game and sort of how things play out. But to your point, I mean, we saw Caleb McDowell sort of being a guy who's a good defensive player but is being recruited as a running back. We talked about how Sam Reynolds is a guy that is probably a slot receiver but can do some stuff out of the backfield. And, yeah, I think there sort of has been a premium not just on speed and athleticism, but on versatility in this recruiting class.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, that just has a lot to do with the way that the game is played today. But I just wonder if we'll see, again, maybe not an emphasis on those guys, but it maybe gives you a little bit more leeway in a time of uncertainty. But, Chris, speaking of uncertainty, ever since Will Muschamp mentioned it last Monday in his teleconference, I really appreciated the way that he talked about some of these early commitments as reservations, maybe more than firm commitments. And I guess when we talked about it wasn't Reynolds last week. Last week was Caleb McDowell. When we talked about Caleb McDowell, I asked, I don't remember which one of you, is this a reservation or is this a commitment? And I'll do this for everybody else just because it's, I think, honestly, like an important and interesting part of the conversation, because so many of them do seem to have been reservations, especially when you think about a place like Tennessee that has a class that's filled out. I think all three of us would be shocked if all 25 of those guys, or 23, or however many their class can hold this year. I'll be shocked if all of those guys stay in there, which is not to say they're not firm commitments, but it's just there's a lot of time for things to change on that front. So, long-winded way of asking, is Jaden Johnson's commitment a commitment or a reservation, Chris?
I think it's a little bit more, I would put it in the commitment category. I think it's on more firm ground than some of them you see. I don't think we're in any position to go through, with a few exceptions, almost anybody's commitment list and say these guys are 1,000% locked in. It's hard to tell nowadays under normal circumstances, and especially now. And so when I look at commitment lists across the country, including South Carolina's, one question I have is, are other schools going to have an opportunity to actually get these guys on campus? I mean, I would think we're going to have in-person recruiting again at some point. When is that? I don't know. It might not even be during the season. It might be. I think, again, the recruiting piece is something that I think will be figured out a little bit later. You got to get to the season, number one, first, make sure that all that's in order. You got to figure out the fans, get all that in order. And you also have to figure out the recruiting piece. So do you let prospects visit for games? That's a piece of it. Do you push it? Do you push it until later after the season? Do you extend, another signing period, for example? I don't know if that will happen, but certainly, there have been a lot of different theories and thoughts, put forth behind the scenes as to what to do. So that's my own long-winded way of saying, I think there's an element of we still don't know what recruiting looks like. So, if we get into the season, maybe let's say Jaden Johnson or some other guys have some huge season and they get a bunch of other schools jumping in, and then do they have an opportunity to go visit them? And because of the recruiting shutdown, do they decide to do that? Mm-hmm. Maybe so. I don't think you can ever rule that out. But right. I do think this wasn't a deal where he just was itching to jump in on somebody's commitment list, and so he just checked off his reservation and did that. I don't get that sense on this one just from everything we've heard.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I guess when I ask you, really just sort of what I'm looking for is, because the only way that we would have any idea unless a guy is to say, yeah, this is the only place, if it's someone from Columbia, it's like, I grew up a Carolina fan, this is the only place I've ever wanted to go. Short of that, I guess just what we would be looking at is sort of the relationship between either his primary recruiter or, Will Muschamp and the kid himself. And it sounds like that's probably what's having you say it's closer to a commitment, is just the relationship there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and again, I think some people look at it on the surface, and it's very fair to do it and say, okay, this guy hasn't visited yet. I mean, gosh, but again, we are in sort of extreme circumstances right now. And so, I think Johnson, South Carolina has very much taken the approach, if they're not going to push guys to get in, they're not going to say, hey, we're running out of spots. I mean, because the evidence shows otherwise. I mean, before Johnson, they had 7 verbal commitments. And so they're not going to push guys. And Will Muschamp's been very outspoken about that, about we're not going to push guys. So you do feel a little bit better about it with all those things, all those factors considered, when, he's just built up a nice, trusting relationship. He doesn't feel pushed. He doesn't feel like he's got to jump in somewhere. When he actually does it on his own time, you tend to feel better about it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, too. And I'd be curious. I mean, I think that is being highlighted now because other schools are putting that pressure on student athletes, but it's not. This isn't new for Will Muschamp. I think he's always sort of taken, I don't want to call it a laissez-faire approach because that makes it sound like he's being passive, but I don't think, he's not a guy that's ever going to pressure a kid, at least not in my knowledge, in my experience, and I think y'all would probably agree with that. So I'd be curious, and I'm just giving you guys a research project that maybe you don't want and maybe you don't have time to do because I know you are busy anyway, but I would be curious to see like what kind of, and it's hard because, again, some commitments are more placeholders than anything, but I wonder what the decommit rate has been for Will Muschamp, at South Carolina, or maybe over the length of his entire career as a coordinator and a head coach, because it does seem like once guys commit to Will Muschamp, they're doing it just because they want to and not because they feel like they need to or they feel like he's pressuring them to do so. And I guess that does make it maybe a little more likely that guys are going to see that commitment through because it is on their terms. Well,
and there's always, first of all, Muschamp recruits in the Southeast and the SEC, so if you're an SEC head coach, you've had decommitments, and you'll have more. That's just the way it is around here. It's part of it. But yeah, they're a little bit different in that respect. I mean, they're not going to be. There are certain situations. For example, South Carolina is going to take probably 2 offensive linemen this year. So at some point, once they get one in the boat, there's going to be 4 or 5 candidates on the board, and they're probably going to tell guys, hey, we've got 1 spot left, not as a pressure tactic, but just to let them know where things stand,
right.
And so that's a little bit different. And so there will be that, there's a prospect, in recent times that, committed early to the staff and then ended up decommitting. And the staff, from my understanding, told him, behind the scenes, look, if you're not ready, you really don't need to commit. And he committed anyway, and then he rolled off the commitment list because he wasn't ready. So, so there are situations like that too, or even if you're telling a kid to pump the brakes. That said, South Carolina is not going to say we're not going to take your commitment if they like it, if they like a player. And you just have to know the situation going in is, hey, this guy's commitment may not be super firm, and you just plan accordingly.
All right, well, Wes, it seems like there's one, I guess the Spurs up that I saw on Twitter yesterday was not for Jaden Johnson. There was another one for Jaden Johnson, but there is another mysterious Spurs up that we're waiting to get verification on. And again, we're recording this a little bit early this week. We're doing this Tuesday morning instead of Wednesday morning. But do you know anything about that Spurs up, and do you know when we might have some more clarification on that Spurs up?
Yeah, and, we've seen this a couple times in the past. Sometimes the Spurs up goes out, and then either, there's a report where the kid has given a heads up on, allowing it to be reported that he's the commitment, or either most of the time these days the kid puts it out himself on Twitter. We've seen a few times where the Spurs up goes out and then it is not revealed, and that's usually just because the kid's getting things in order as far as how he wants to put his commitment out and stuff. That's the case here. I would expect the commitment to come out sometime, in the next week. But, and also I think this is kind of the case where, I believe the specific guy that refers to is probably going to be in a week or so. But, I think there's some other guys in the meantime that South Carolina is also in really good shape with and could potentially, make a decision. So I think there obviously is that one official Spurs up that's hanging out there that everybody's waiting on. But I think you could maybe even see some potentially other Spurs up come out here soon. We talked a little bit last week, on the Insiders Forum about how South Carolina has the chance to have maybe a little run of commitments, and we saw that with Jaden Johnson, and then, of course, the second Spurs up. It seems like, for whatever reason, guys, that these things sometimes just come in waves. It's like it'll be quiet for a while, and then South Carolina will land a few guys in a row, and I think that this is a situation where you could, maybe see that happen in the next week or so.
And Wes, now that players are back on campus, and obviously last week was the first full week of voluntary workouts. I almost called them involuntary workouts, which would have been a great Freudian slip, but they are, in fact, voluntary workouts. But now that obviously Will Muschamp can't be there in an official capacity, he's still conducting Zoom meetings, is my understanding, but it's just Paul Jackson and the players. So it's not like he's necessarily more directly involved with what's happening now that players are back on campus. But from what you've gleaned just in the last week or so, how much does that change? I mean, not exactly the recruiting calendar, because that remains the same, but should we expect more or fewer Spurs up over the course of the next couple weeks as Carolina gets closer to resuming practice and starting sort of the football season proper?
Yeah, I think more, like I said, and if anything, recruiting has been, I would say, probably still at a breakneck speed here the last couple of weeks. Just this week, Chris, we saw, I guess, yesterday on Monday, if you were paying attention on Twitter, there were a ton of new offers sent out. Now, most of them to sort of underclassmen guys. You can almost see the process playing out as South Carolina is just working their way through not just seniors, but then down through the juniors and now even through the different sophomores that are already sort of making a name for themselves. So there were a lot of underclassmen offers that went out, yesterday. I think from what I've heard, that's been a big focus for South Carolina now, is just to go ahead and try to get a leg up and offer some of these underclassmen. So, even though the players are back, like you said, that's more Paul Jackson and his staff who are focused on them. They still have the Zoom meetings, of course, but they've been having those. So there's been a huge recruiting focus now. Once we get into this calendar we're going to talk about here in a second, I think at some point around mid-July, maybe the focus turns more towards the actual team. But right now there's a lot of recruiting. And I do think, in my experience, there is sort of a push from prospects just in general. Once they start, there a lot of places are starting to be able to get back to workouts as well. And then once you start getting into July and then August, there's a usual just general push for kids to get some recruiting out of the way before they really dive into their senior season. So I think you always just see a little run of commitments from that standpoint as well. So now how is that usual trend affected by the current situation? I don't know, but a lot of guys are just like, I want to be focused on my season. Now this year, if you've waited all the way to July or August and you're still wanting to take some visits, it might be smart just to go ahead and wait if you've waited this long. So we'll see how that plays out.
You mentioned the schedule, so I guess we'll segue into that now, not even the recruiting schedule exactly, but the schedule for resuming football activities in a more official capacity. This was reported last week after it was voted on by the NCAA Football Oversight Committee, and that is my understanding, and Wes, I think maybe you know a little bit more about this process. My understanding is that is a recommendation that will have to be made official by the NCAA Division I Council, but that part of it, that vote, which I think is expected to take place later this week, either Thursday or Friday, is going to be something of a formality. It's basically that they listen to the recommendations of the Football Oversight Committee, but they have approved or at least approved a recommendation of a schedule that would see July 13th be the first day that coaches are able to formally have access to their players for 8 hours a week for a 2-week period. And then starting on July 24th, they would move to 20-hour weeks, which I think is I think pretty normal and pretty much on schedule, and have sort of an NFL-style OTA, which we had talked a lot about being a possibility in this sort of abbreviated offseason, and then August 7th being the official start of preseason camp. So I guess, Wes, anything more you know about that process, anything that I got wrong? Although I'm reading this from the Gamecock Central newsletter, which, by the way, y'all should all be a subscriber to. It's for free. All you have to do is put in your email address, and you just get everything that you need to know for the day, for the week, whatever, in your email inbox every single morning. That is where I'm reading this. That's where I read it on my show last week. It's very, very useful. I appreciate y'all doing this very much because it's a wonderful resource. But those are the big dates. What else do you know about the process of what this will look like in terms of implementation, Wes?
Yeah, I mean, if you got it wrong, then you have no one to blame but me. Because,
yeah, exactly.
I was the one who put that together based on the reporting initially from Bruce Feldman, I think it was. But, yeah, my understanding is, so you've got the NCAA Football Oversight Committee, and they pass basically recommendations, and then the NCAA Division I Council will vote to approve it or not approve it. And the reporting from the national guys is that basically at this point it will just be a formality. I think the vote is this Friday, but it's expected to be approved. And, you know, these are the dates for teams that start the same time that South Carolina does. If you start week 0, as we've seen become more and more popular, you can basically move it up 7 days, move it up a week. But basically on July 13th, the way it was phrased is that the coaches will finally have access to their players. They'll continue the strength and conditioning work, but they'll also be able to have in-person meetings with the staff as opposed to just the Zoom meetings. Then, as you said, July 24th, they'll move to 20-hour weeks that will be like NFL-style OTAs. And the big thing there is there will be walkthroughs with the football and with the staff all present. So essentially that is like a sort of acclimation period, and an easy way to transition into your normal preseason football stuff, which will begin on August 7th, which I believe will be – obviously there will be, I imagine, new safety protocols for that compared to most years. But as far as what that will actually look like structurally, you know, I think about the same, if not exactly the same. So that July 24th to August 7th period is basically – I think it's really smart, you know, a way to just ease into it as opposed to just being like, hey, guys, go do the Oklahoma drill and get yourselves hurt.
Yeah. Although they don't do that anymore, do they?
Do what?
The Oklahoma drill. I thought they didn't do that anymore. I thought it was too dangerous or something. Or maybe that was a Spurrier thing, or maybe some places don't do it, or they still do it?
No, they call it the cock drill around here.
Okay. Oh, that's good.
They do the cock drill. I think you don't do it obviously day one because there's a built-in period where you don't have pads on and all that stuff. But I believe that's still a day one of full pads tradition. I think is the old Oklahoma drill.
Okay, all right, cool. Well, I'm glad they still do that. I remember not exactly fondly, but I certainly remember doing that in my brief football playing days. Chris, this is a pretty normal calendar. I mean, normally. So my birthday is on August 2nd, and Eric's birthday, Eric Camry, that I do the local show with on 107.5, his birthday is August 1st, and it's always around our birthdays that players are reporting and starting practice, and that's how I know it, because that's what we're talking about. It's like, hey, happy birthday, Eric, players are reporting, or hey, happy birthday, Pearson, players are reporting. So it's happening a couple days later, but I guess the season's starting a little bit later than it normally does. Like I think last year, they played North Carolina on, August 31st or September 1st, and this year the first game's not until September 5th, so the schedule is pretty normal. So I mean, we're sitting here having gone through all of this, and all the other sports shutting down, and baseball hasn't started back, and the NBA and NHL are going to have abbreviated regular seasons, and it's just been crazy. But other than a few missed spring practices, this is going to end up being a pretty normal football calendar, at least for the guys on the team.
Yeah, this model would be, and so this is a little bit different. We've been talking about how college football for several weeks. We've talked about it here on the podcast that there was a push to do some type of like OTAs, right, to sort of bridge the gap between, for missing out on spring practices. I think I saw Ross Dellinger, I think, had a note in one of his stories that, I think like 52 out of 130 FBS teams didn't have spring practice at all. And so South Carolina had some, right? But there was a way to, like Wes was saying, you sort of give these players an opportunity to transition into preseason camp. And so the OTAs that we've been discussing for a while, we've talked about 6-week models and 8-week models, with it being a progression from weight room stuff to OTAs, which is sort of a light, less contact, type of practice, similar to what the NFL does, to preseason practice. And so to me, I don't know if I'd even call it a surprise, but the difference in this model from some of the ones that we've heard is you still got the stuff, the weight room stuff transitioning into OTAs, transitioning into camp, but you've got a longer camp period here. One of the models that was tossed around was like a 6-week model where you got, 2 weeks of this, 2 weeks of this, 2 weeks of this. And so this is a longer, this is your typical sort of camp period. And so I think coaches will be, as long as nothing happens between now and then,
right,
I think coaches and players alike will be well pleased with this if this ends up happening, because it gives you a lot of prep time, particularly those schools that had absolutely no spring practice. They're going to want every bit of it.
Well, and for Will Muschamp,
and even if they do have spring practice, they want every bit of it.
Right. Well, yeah, and especially because I guess I don't remember if we were talking about this on the podcast last week or who I was talking to about this, but so much of spring, because my understanding is it's not a lot of install, so it's not like they necessarily lost a lot of time. People are like, oh, you're installing a new offense and you miss spring, and it doesn't sound like that's typically what it's for, but you're losing a lot of reps, especially for the younger guys, and that becomes so valuable, especially in a place like South Carolina where, frankly, you're really operating on the margins, and the difference between 4-8 and 7-5 is a couple injuries here and there, and the backup either being 90% as good as the guy ahead of him versus 60% of the good, 60% as good as the guy ahead of him, and a lot of that comes down to being able to get the reps, not exactly game reps, but closer to game reps than maybe just the mental reps or the leadership reps, as Butch Jones would call them. So that's kind of what you're losing in spring, but maybe you can make up for it a lot in the course of this extended preseason. And like I was saying, Will Muschamp said 8 weeks to prepare for the season, and including the conditioning that's going on right now, it's going to end up being about 12. So again, fingers crossed that things stay, I guess, tenable on campus and in Columbia, even though we're seeing a little bit of we're seeing a lot of a spike around here. Hopefully that the football team is mostly insulated from that and can sort of continue on this schedule and everybody remains healthy and things like that. But the other part that I wonder, Wes, because I'm being made aware of the fact that I'm less familiar with the football calendar than I realized, and I know that players are normally on campus and working out throughout the course of the summer, and then they normally report at the beginning of August. But what kind of access does the head coach and do the coaches outside of the strength coach typically have to the players during the summer before they report for August? Because having 8 hours and then 20 hours for parts of July for Will Muschamp to meet with a team, isn't that unusual?
That's a good question. It sort of all runs together for me as well. I know the workout portion, generally is just strength staff. Chris, maybe you can help me. I know in recent years it seems like they've given them a little bit more access as far as meeting with the players during the summer. I just don't know what the hour limit is. Do you know off the top of your head, Chris?
No, there's different times of the year. I don't have it in front of me. You get like the 20-hour rule and countable athletic activities and all these different things. But yeah, the summer is much heavier on the player aspect of it, because you get the more quote unquote voluntary stuff. Coach, strength and conditioning staff obviously is very hands-on players at that time, but you get player run practices, and that's not stuff that the coaching staff is super involved with.
Yeah, so I can't remember how recent it was, but I do know, Pearson, that fairly recently I think they changed some of the access to where you'd have, like Chris said, you'd have strength and conditioning staff would have them part of the day. They do PRPs, the player run practices, the other part. Then there would be some meeting elements where they could actually go sit down and talk about different things, which it sounds crazy, but what I remember before, there was a long section during the summer that wasn't allowed at all. So, or was very limited. So I know the players and coaches are probably thankful to have that time.
Yeah, I mean, it should be good, and I don't know. Like, it feels weird to say that it may end up. I mean, it's never going to be good that there was a shutdown, because for a lot of the players, they're going to probably be a little bit out of shape. Will Muschamp, I appreciate his. I don't know, experience or at least just willingness to accept the fact that not everyone on his team is going to come back in the best shape of their life, and that some guys will have done absolutely nothing for the last 3 months. So, that part of it is never good, and that part's going to be hard to make up. But, I mean, ultimately, this could end up being a good thing for places like South Carolina, because they have a little bit more time and because they've had access to these Zoom meetings to install offense and things like that. And for the younger players, maybe it'll end up being easier to get them into the fold because you've been able to address sort of the mental part of the game and the schematic part of the game a little bit earlier and a little more often than you normally would have. But again, this is all still up in the air. These are tentative plans. Again, the NCAA will officially vote on it later this week. That is the NCAA Division I Council. I can never keep all these like subgroups and little committees names straight, but that's the one. Again, reading it from the newsletter, so it's impossible for me to get it wrong. But as we get more information and as we progress a little bit closer to these official practices, we'll certainly have more information and keep you up to date. One more recruiting thing that I wanted to do before we get out of here today, and not exactly recruiting as you're thinking about it, because we did all the relevant recruiting news for this South Carolina team off the top, but for a couple weeks in a row, I was teasing the Tales from the Trail, and we never really got into it. But I'm fascinated by these stories. I love listening to y'all tell recruiting stories, and a lot of it's just like off the air, and we're just talking about whatever, and you're like, hey, you remember that time that we went to go see so-and-so? And it's like, oh, yeah, that was awesome. And those are like really cool. And like I said, most of them are off the air. So I wanted to give you two an opportunity and our listeners the opportunity to sort of hear some behind-the-scenes perspectives of, guys that maybe they would have recognized. And I had like a whole big idea for this, but we'll just do a smaller version of it now, and we can maybe do a few more of these or change it up or something as the offseason progresses. And, frankly, we need to dip back into the content machine as we wait for news to come out of voluntary workouts and practices and things like that. But Wes and Chris, your prompt today is simple and hopefully a fun and encouraging exercise. I want you guys to go back, and y'all have both been covering recruiting for over a decade each. So you've talked to a lot of guys that have gone to South Carolina, a lot of guys that have gone to other schools, guys from a lot of different places, guys that have lived up to their expectations, guys that have exceeded expectations, and guys that have come up relatively short of what their expectations were. I'll start with you, Chris. Who is a guy that you were really high on, that maybe you got a chance to see early as a sophomore or a junior, that you knew he was going to blow up before he got big, and he did, in fact, end up blowing up? Basically, what is your biggest win personally since you've been following recruiting?
And this is a guy that could go to South Carolina or not?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Just anybody that you've covered. And presumably, since you've mostly been doing it for Carolina, I guess it will be someone that was at least on Carolina's radar, or Carolina was on his radar. But, even if he didn't go there, like if you, I don't know, like maybe Arian Foster, I have no idea if he ever considered Carolina or Carolina ever pursued him. But someone like that, and you saw him as a sophomore, and you're like, that guy's going to be awesome. And people are like, what? Who is that? And then it's like, yeah, he's going to be the number one pick in everybody's fantasy draft for like 3 years in a row.
So there are a couple guys. This is sort of a cheat. Now, I'm gonna go with Carolina guys just because a couple guys that popped to mind, and I watched them closely. So, one was Javon Kinlaw, with a caveat. I saw Javon for the first time at a combine at York High, and I think he was 15 or 16 years old.
My alma mater, FYI.
That's right. Yep. Wes deserves credit for Kinlaw's development, because he went to a combine at Wes's alma mater. But Kinlaw, he was 6'5", 286. I don't know why I remember the specifics of that, but that's what he was. And he had no idea what he was doing. So this was a combine. So there was no actual like football stuff. It was all like they let him bench press. They let him like push a sled. They let him run a 40. And Kinlaw didn't know how to do any of it. I mean, none of it. And he was super raw. He had just transferred to Goose Creek from Friendship Academy in D.C. But you looked at him. I always looked at him, and I was like, this kid, if he figures it out, could be really, really good. And the caveat that I mentioned is that I thought Kinlaw was going to be an O-lineman. A bunch of people thought that. College coaches, his high school head coach at the time, Chuck Reedy, who had college experience, head coach at Baylor, assistant coach experience. You know, a lot of people thought he was going to be an O-lineman. And I'll go to my grave saying that Javon could be an elite offensive tackle. I mean, I think he could be awesome. But he also turned out to be awesome as a defensive lineman. And so credit him for that and his development. You know, the staff at Jones County, Javon, South Carolina's coaches for developing him. So that's one. Another I remember was, you know, not that this is any huge win, but Brian Edwards is a guy that I remember. I think actually Will Muschamp offered him first at Florida when Edwards was a freshman at Conway. But I remember seeing Edwards' tape as a freshman and going, yeah, this kid's going to be extremely good. And he ended up getting, you know, a pretty nice offer list, probably not as big as it should have been even. He was a 4-star guy and obviously had a really good career and got drafted. But those are a couple guys that early on just popped in my head immediately.
So when you were talking to other people, either in recruiting circles or at schools or, you know, I don't know who you talk to about this kind of stuff, were you met with like, oh, really? Like this guy that has no idea what he's doing, you really think that he's going to be a stud? I mean, did you have to convince him, or were you just like, you just keep it to yourself, or what?
No, I mean, I do think even some people around Goose Creek were like, I'm not really sure just because he is so raw. They go, I mean, look, this kid's huge. You know, he's got upside. And you know, I think he just wasn't as much on the radar. I mean, even out of high school, like he ended up getting offered by Florida when Muschamp was there. South Carolina offered him with the Spurrier staff. I think Clemson had offered. And, you know, but it was a deal just where he was on the radar, but he wasn't, you know, nobody was like, this guy's a first-round pick. Now, when he went to Jones County after South Carolina placed him there, he ended up continuing to progress, grew, matured some, you know, physically, and then Alabama and Southern Cal and all these people offered him. And then people were, okay, you know, this guy's got a chance to be good. So I wouldn't say people fought against it or anything. And you know, to be clear, I'm not trying to credit myself too much. I mean, I never
that's
said,
what the segment's for,
right?
to make sure everyone knows that you and Wes know more than everybody else. That's what this is for. I'm building you guys up.
Well, I appreciate it, but I don't. You're misrepresenting the skill set a little bit. So,
all right. Well, hold on. Let me get one more follow up, and then I'll get Wes's perspective on this. Because this is a similar question, but not exactly the same question. Was there anybody that you were really, really bullish on that other people didn't necessarily think was going to pan out for one reason or another? Whether it was, I mean, you saw potential as a late bloomer, or maybe there was like injury trouble early in high school or something like that. But some guy that you were like, I refuse to believe that this guy's not going to be good, and he ended up being good.
Man, I mean, that's not one I've given a ton of thought to. So there's not a guy that really comes to mind. Maybe Wes has one there. I can't really, off the top of my head, on the spot, think of a guy that I just, you know, was sort of quote unquote standing on the table for that nobody believed in. Nobody really comes to mind there.
All right, Wes, your turn.
See, I want to say a guy that I think by the end of the recruiting process, most people were on board with. But I do think I was a little bit early on Pharaoh Cooper.
Nice. That's a good one.
Oh, yeah.
I think, you know, Chris and I at the time probably even talked to the same person. I think we were working for different companies, but one of his coaches there that we both know was just very high on Pharaoh for a long time and was telling anybody who would listen that this guy was like the best kept secret in Havelock, North Carolina, which is just a far drive from about anywhere other than New Bern, North Carolina, you know, over that way. And so Pharaoh, I do think as far as him blowing up into a big prospect, I was probably early on Luke Doty, just being introduced to that family early on and sort of seeing Luke run and just talking to him and seeing the leadership ability and being like, man, this guy is a Division I athlete. Not sure yet. I think he was in like 8th grade. Wasn't sure yet how he was going to develop or what it was going to look like down the road. But I was high on Luke for a while there. I do, not as a prospect, but I do distinctly remember telling people on the Gamecock Central message boards when Deebo Samuel was like a true freshman and maybe even a redshirt freshman, that there were people at South Carolina telling me that if you watch South Carolina's practice from a distance, like from the overhead stuff, that you couldn't tell the difference between Deebo and Pharaoh. That basically, because remember at the time Deebo was like sort of a little bit of an unknown unless you talk to maybe high school coaches that had played against them in the state.
So that was what, 2015? Pharaoh's last year? Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right. And but basically, but
people knew who Pharaoh was.
Pharaoh was a very much known commodity, best player on the offense, basically. And if you would have said at the time Deebo is as good as Pharaoh, you get some eye rolls, and then we see what Deebo ends up being. But that was more just people at practice telling me what they were seeing. But I remember catching a little bit of grief that Deebo's not, you've overhyped Deebo, and then obviously Deebo ended up being one of the best playmakers this school has ever seen. So, but I think for the most part, the guys like that, there wasn't like that big national, like Deebo wasn't like this big 4-star recruit, chose South Carolina over a couple of other offers. But if you talk to high school coaches in the state, they knew, they were like, this guy could be a problem if he puts it all together.
Yeah. I have to mention this. I had no plan of bringing this up, but I saw it on Twitter this morning, and since you mentioned Deebo, I have to mention this. Did y'all see Chad Johnson, formerly Chad Ochocinco, formerly Chad Johnson, tweeting out an endorsement of Deebo this morning?
Yes. Yeah.
Said Deebo Samuel, ...
Worded.
Yeah, it says, man, listen to me. I know my bleep. That bleeper is 3 fire emoji. And, very sounds very much like Chad Johnson, just speaking from the heart. And, what an endorsement, again, to come from a guy like Chad Johnson. So there you go. That's a good one, Wes. Chad Johnson agrees with you. And I'm realizing now.
I love Chad Johnson.
I know. He's the best, man. Oh, man, he's great. I'm thinking about this now after we finish the exercise, but I think the way that I should have done this was I should have asked Chris who Wes's biggest win was and Wes who Chris's biggest win was, because y'all are both so magnanimous. You're not gonna pound your chest and say, oh, I was on this guy, but y'all totally do that for each other. So maybe next time we do one of these, I'll do it like that, because y'all are going to be much more complimentary of one another than you are of yourselves, which is a good thing. I should learn from your humility, but I'm probably not going to. But okay, do y'all have any other ideas? Any other? Not now, obviously, but well, I want to ask you on the podcast. But y'all be brainstorming of some other ideas, some tales from the trail, some other recruiting stories that you want to tell. Because, like I said, we'll keep dipping back into this as we progress sort of through the off season. But as much as I teased that, I wanted to get to that and really get your perspective on that. Although what I would love to do, and especially y'all have both kind of mentioned this. This seems like the way to do it, is like to get some high school coaches on here and be like, hey, who did you know? Because those guys know. I mean, because they see everybody and they all talk to each other. But like in some ways, like there's not as much, certainly there's not as much money in it, not as much notoriety and things like that. But in some ways, it's got to be a blast to be a high school football coach in a talent-rich area, because, I mean, you just see everyone, you know everything, you have a lot of those relationships. Like that's got to be cool to be watching those guys progress from that age, because by and large, most people, NFL scouts and things like that probably just start watching guys in college. So anyway, maybe we'll have to do that one of these days. But that'll do it for us today. Thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to GamecockCentral.com and subscribe to the Gamecock Central Podcast Network. Rate it and review it and share it with your friends as well if you want to support the podcast, since this pod is free. That's a great way to support it. But we'll be back next week with more recruiting notes, with hopefully some updates from voluntary workouts, maybe even a clear picture of what the rest of the summer is going to look like as South Carolina tries to resume practice on a pretty normal schedule. We'll all cross our fingers for that for the next week and change. But for Wes and Chris, I'm Pearson. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.